I'm Mike Duran. I'm a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute, and I'm also the director of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East. And it's my distinct pleasure to host today Mohammed Al-Yahya. Hello, Mohammed.
Hi.
Mohammed, you are a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute, but you've also distinguished yourself in the last year, I think, as the foremost Saudi proponent of the U.S.-American relationship. The U.S.-Saudi relationship. And probably the most incisive analyst of that relationship today. So at this moment, it's really particularly exciting for me. You're my friend, but it's still exciting for me at this moment to have this conversation with you because it couldn't be more timely. Let's start with your understanding of the recently brokered deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, brokered by China. Let's just tell us how you understand the view from Riyadh of that deal.
Sure. Thank you for having me, of course, and thank you for the kind introduction. And it would be great to have it in writing.
We have it here. It's preserved for posterity on YouTube.
Yeah, yeah. A lot has been written about the deal, that it's a Saudi-Iranian deal, that it's a rapprochement or sort of peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And while parts of that might be true, this is primarily a deal with China, right? The Iranians have been very keen on reestablishing diplomatic ties for several years now. There have been talks for a few years in Baghdad and elsewhere between Saudi and Iranian officials. Those talks haven't led anywhere meaningful. But the role that China is playing is what makes this current deal different. It's being underwritten by the Chinese, it's being guaranteed by the Chinese, and the Chinese have considerable leverage over the Iranians that the United States does not have, that European countries do not have. The Iranians can't afford to sever the relationship with China. China is the largest source of foreign currency coming into Iran, jeopardizing that relationship for the Iranians could mean very quick economic collapse. So you have a situation right now where there are three actors, all with distinct interests. Some of them overlap with each other that came together to make this deal work. Now, who knows how long it will last, but what makes it different is that China is involved, and China has been seeking to play a larger strategic role in the region for many years, with its base in Djibouti, with its efforts to ramp up cooperation with its Gulf partners. So at this juncture, when there are tensions in the region, going with this Beijing brokered agreement is meant to reduce tensions absent other great powers.
So the response from the White House was interesting. John Kirby, spokesman for the National Security Council, said that this is not about China. Looking at it from an American point of view, this is not about China. We don't need to be worried about it. The United States has been trying to reduce tensions in the region since the Biden administration came into power. This is basically win-win for everyone, and we, the Americans, we're not concerned about China stealing a march on the United States. I know you're not here to tell us what the American interest is, but what's your reaction to that?
You're right. I'm sure that the American administration has a better grasp of what American interests are, but there is dissonance here, and it's important to note it. While the Americans want to pivot away from the region ostensibly to counter China to the east, the Chinese are starting to look at the region as a primary arena for competition, great power competition with the United States. So while a certain class of policymakers in the United States might think this is not about China, it seems to me that people in Beijing think this is about the United States, right? And at the end of the day, people in the region are concerned with their own self-interest. They're concerned with bringing stability. Saudi Arabia is undergoing this massive transformation that could be derailed if we were to see conventional war or escalated tensions in the region. So it's through that lens, I think, that people in the region, whether it's Saudi Arabia or other Gulf actors, are seeking to expand their relationships with multiple great powers. And the idea isn't to pivot away from the United States. Pivots, imply, facing one direction and then choosing to face another one at the expense of the first direction you're facing. That's not what the Saudis are doing.
Although, if I understood your answer to my first question, you are saying this is a deal between Saudi Arabia and China. That from Riyadh's point of view, that is the most important part of the deal. And China has things to offer Saudi Arabia that the United States doesn't, in particular, influence in Tehran.
Yes.
So from the Chinese point of view, as you see it, this is about China and the United States. And from the Saudi point of view, this is about China filling a vacuum left by the United States as it, call it whatever you want, pivots away from the Middle East, downgrades the United States, recalibrates, whatever verb you want to put in. There's an opening that the United States has created for China, and China is exploiting it. And Saudi Arabia has chosen to go with China in that dimension.
In this specific agreement, yes, that's the case. But I think it's no secret that China is very different today than it was certainly 10 years ago, but also 5 years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. The Chinese are increasingly starting to look at the region in strategic terms. While 7 years ago, maybe Chinese diplomats were much more concerned when speaking with their Arab counterparts, with trade, commerce, investment, commodities. Today, they're starting to speak in strategic terms. They're starting to speak about strategic influence. Right? So that there is a shift in the way that the Chinese are looking at the region and looking at their own role in the world. Right? You see a lot of pundits, here and elsewhere, talking about the Chinese replacing the United States. I don't think they're at a stage where they can replace the United States wholesale and its alliances, right? And if you look at the amount of countries in the world that are going in the direction of wholesale replacing the United States, there are a few. You can count them on one hand. Maybe Pakistan is one country that is comfortable with the idea of doubling down on China at the expense of robust relations with the United States. But nobody in the region is looking at it that way. I think the issue that people have in the region is that they feel that there is no clarity about what the U.S. sees its own role is in the world, let alone just only the region. And once they get that clarity, they can make policies to suit it. At the end of the day, the United States still is the most powerful country in the world. It is the most, it has the strongest military, and it has the strongest economic might. But I think there is confusion among not only American partners in Riyadh or the Gulf, but also in Tel Aviv and also in Ankara, right? If you speak to officials from all of these countries, you're going to notice that the overlap and their confusion on American strategic priorities is quite similar.
It's true. I want to come back to you about the Israelis and the Turks, but let's stay for a second on this question about supplanting the United States, because I'm actually among those who are saying China is working to supplant the United States. I agree with you 100%. China cannot today supplant the United States. But I have been warning about this for several years now. And when I first started writing and saying China seeks to supplant the United States, the counter argument was, no, the Chinese are happy with the American order. They don't have any hard power security aspirations at all. They won't get involved in any of the difficult bilateral conflicts in the region because all they want is access to markets. They just want to extract resources, and they want to trade, with everyone, and they benefit from the American order, and they understand that, and they're not going to try to they're not going to engage in any kind of competition. Now the argument is different. Now the argument is, oh, okay, well, there's some competition going on, yes, but they don't have the hard power tools to supplant the United States, and therefore the United States doesn't have to be concerned about it. So there's an admission of competition, but the competitor isn't that great. So from my point of view, it looks like by the time we wake up to the fact that there's a serious competition going on, and that we could be supplanted. The moment we realize that is going to be the day after we were supplanted. I know enough history of the Middle East to know that countries like Iran was solidly in the American camp one day. Then there was a revolution, and it wasn't. Egypt was solidly in the Soviet camp, and then one day Sadat decided he didn't want to be in the Soviet camp, and he was in the American camp. I wrote a book on the Suez Crisis, and in 1956, the United States never made a decision to undermine and destroy the British position in the Middle East, but that's what it did. So I can imagine a scenario whereby we begin with decisions like the one that Riyadh just made, and we get to a point where Riyadh comes to a conclusion. Not just Riyadh; it could be Abu Dhabi. It could be even Israel. We'll wake up one day and say, the framework in which we want to solve all of our bilateral problems is the Chinese framework rather than the American framework. Not because we don't like the Americans, not because they're a problem, but because they're just absent. That to me is a real possibility.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I wrote in one of the articles I published recently on China that China's rise, at the very least, where we stand today, can never be attributed to anything but the Americans choosing not to engage or choosing not to have a framework or maintain or cultivate a camp, right? That's the only way the Chinese can actually even think of supplanting the United States. So American power still exists. It's still, the most relevant power that we see in the region. America's security order might be struggling, but it still exists. And it's, from the perspective of many people in the region, it's an American decision whether they want to maintain that order, whether they feel that order is serving them or not serving them. But the idea is to get that type of clarity. And that's what I think is missing from what's going on. And it's worth noting that at the end of the day, nobody in their right mind in the region wants to have the Chinese or any other actor supplant the United States. People are looking for the tools to protect themselves, the munitions. They're looking for American technology, which is still superior to the Chinese technology. But it's also worth considering that over the past 5 years, China does have much more to offer than it did in the past. Right? If you look at Chinese 5G technology, if you look at the quality of electric cars that China is producing locally, you can say that all of this technology is technology that's borrowed, for lack of a better term, from the United States. But at the end of the day, these are tangible things that the Chinese are selling. They weren't selling in the past.
Another thing we're seeing in the press is reports that China is helping Saudi Arabia with uranium development and with its nuclear development.
Right, and yeah, that takes us to another point. I mean, again, the Saudis and many other actors in the region are trying to look towards their partners, American partners, in the same way that they've historically looked at them. They're trying to benefit from the technology that the Americans have. They're trying to buy the equipment, the military equipment, the munitions that they need to protect their own homelands. So the idea that Saudi Arabia or other actors in the region are looking for Americans to die to protect their energy infrastructure is a very mistaken one. What they're looking for is the tools to be independent and to be able to do that on their own. And that's what they're struggling with, right? So, for example, the Saudis, from what I understand, have tried to get American support for their nuclear program, rather than just selling. Saudi Arabia has 6% of the world's uranium.
And when you say from what you understand, you mean from discussing this matter with senior officials?
Yes, I've discussed this particular matter with an official. And what they're trying to do is cultivate the technology in their own country to create fuel out of that uranium. And they have no problem selling that fuel after they enrich it to the United States. The United States, I think, if I'm not mistaken, still buys Russian uranium. And that's not something that the Saudis have been successful at doing. The problem is this is a 60 or 70-year-old technology, what they're looking at. The French can do it. The Russians can do it. The Chinese can do it.
So the Saudis basically are asking the United States to work with them to develop a nuclear program on the same level as the Iranian program. Yeah. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah.
And the Americans are saying no. the Iranians get,
Facing
Saudi Arabia, the ally, does not get the standard that the Iranians get.
To be fair, the Americans aren't actively supporting the Iranian nuclear program with technology and whatnot. But and that's what we're looking for as partners. But I mean,
okay, we won't argue about that. I mean, there's indirectly they are. I mean, they permitted and promote, including the Russian. They promote even the Russian.
But yeah, I think we've got it right in general, right? The Saudis are not interested in giving their raw uranium out to third parties to enrich and make fuel and then buy it back. They want that capability on their own, and today the Iranians have that capability.
But do I understand you correctly in the way you worded your analysis of this uranium question, that they offered this, they asked the Americans for this first, didn't get it, and then turned to the Chinese?
Well, the Chinese, the Russians, the French, it's not just the Chinese that are alternative to the United States on this technology or in terms of munitions or technology, right? I mean, there's Europe, there's Southeast Asia. I mean, it's a large world. But, you know, an official also told me at one point in time that, you know, this is not a pivot away from the United States. This is a very difficult time in the relationship with the United States. But what the Saudis will do is they'll always ask the Americans first. If it's on munitions, if it's jets, they'll always knock the American door first. But there's only so much they can do if that door is shut in their faces, right? And that's where these alternatives that have been rapidly showing up across the world over the past years start becoming more attractive.
And of course, last year, 2 years ago, Saudi Arabia was going to be a pariah, and then after the OPEC Plus decision by Saudi Arabia in the summer, there was a statement from the White House that there was going to be a significant reevaluation of the relationship with Saudi Arabia. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that there's been a significant amount of denigration of the Saudis, both from the White House and even more from Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I think you know, at the core of this is a failure to understand that Saudi Arabia has its own interests, and it's a country that has laid out these interests and has no issue speaking about them transparently, right? The Saudis were told they would become pariahs, and then, as you said, the relationship will be recalibrated. And then after they were attacked by Iran, Patriot batteries were pulled out of Saudi Arabia instead of reinforced with more Patriot batteries. And then when the Saudis cut production along with OPEC Plus, essentially the ask from the Americans was to shred the OPEC Plus in its entirety, right? Because if you increase production unilaterally, that means the entire organization that the Saudis and other OPEC partners consider their signature foreign policy achievement just goes into the shredder, right? So the idea here is, and then they were called names for allegedly supporting Russia, and then soon thereafter they paid $400 million in aid to President Zelensky and to Ukraine. And then they were told, no, you're not allowed to meet with the Russians. And they were told, you should probably not meet with the Chinese as well. So the Saudis are quite confused. And what is it that they can do? I mean,
I feel for you. But if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, because I would see the chronology something like the following. Under Trump, the United States developed its own fossil fuel industry to such an extent that the global price dropped, putting great pressure on the Saudis. The Saudis respond by working together with the Russians in OPEC Plus. And then the Biden team comes along, has a completely different domestic policy on oil and gas, and doesn't want to develop its own domestic resources. Quite the opposite. I think there's a backroom deal between the progressives and Biden to not develop American resources to the extent possible. So then they turn to the Saudi Arabia and demand a completely different policy from the Saudis. So you get whipsawed by different administrations when they come in, when they have completely different policies. And what you're asking for is some kind of baseline, some kind of continuity that they can count on.
To a large degree, yes, of course. But I mean, without going too deep into energy stuff, the United States might be one of the world's largest oil producers. At one point in time, it was a net exporter, and everybody in think tanks and the media loved to have this idea we don't need oil from elsewhere, but that's not really how these things work, right?
Right.
The federal government of the United States has zero leverage over the output of this country in terms of oil, right? It's private.
I'd quibble with you about that, but
I mean, if
you can kill it in committee with any regulation. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Go ahead.
Texas Railroad, something that's supposed to be, it does nothing, right? The oil is owned by private business people and private oil companies that exist in Montana and Texas. They might produce a lot of oil, but they can't act as a central bank for oil. They can't have any impact on the price of oil. And that's where the importance of a country like Saudi Arabia comes into play. The Saudis are paying considerable amounts of money on a daily basis to maintain a spare capacity of around 2 million barrels. Right, the strength of Saudi Arabian oil markets is its ability to convene these members of OPEC Plus and to stabilize oil prices, and in the event of any catastrophe that happens in the world, have enough spare capacity on hand in order to stabilize oil prices. And that's what happened in April 2020 when you mentioned the oil price war with Russia. The Russians at that point in time tried to challenge the Saudi position, and they challenged it by saying, we're not going to stick to your quotas, right? And what they wanted was, it was a game theory issue, right? What they wanted was for them to be pumping oil as much as they like, but everyone else in OPEC Plus to be sticking to the quotas, which doesn't work, right? Because if they don't stick to the quotas, then everybody else won't stick to the quotas, and then you don't have an OPEC Plus agreement. The Saudis played hardball at that point in time and sent an armada of over 20 ships calling every single Russian port and saying, we're offering discounts. And that's when oil went towards $20 a barrel and was being sold in the negative here in the United States. At that point in time, what you had was, these lobby groups on behalf of American oil producers saying pressure the Saudis to cut production, thereby shredding OPEC Plus, right? And the Saudis said, just wait. This is a staring contest between us and Russia, and we'll win. And they did. Russia came back to the table. It was President Trump at that point in time that brokered the deal. And today, as you mentioned, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing the Saudis being told to shred OPEC Plus again, but for the opposite reason, to get the prices to come down. And the Saudis would respond to the Americans and other actors who have issues with this by saying, look, the market fundamentals are as they are. This is our bread and butter. We understand. We're cutting production. This is what happened in October. But oil prices will still come down. The market's oversupplied. And lo and behold, 2 weeks after they cut, prices did come down. And that's when we saw a reduction in tensions and these incendiary statements that you see on Saudi Arabia siding with Russia or whatever. Saudi Arabia, of course.
When I watched President Biden go to Saudi Arabia last summer and seek to find some kind of agreement on this issue of oil price, I can't help but feel like they have the White House. This White House has an image in their mind that there's this lever that the United States can pull, the Saudi lever, which they're familiar. They know their history. They know that during the Cold War, this lever was instrumental in bringing down the Soviet Union, and in many crises in the past, the Saudis have been useful to the United States and as a partner for stabilizing the price of oil globally. And so they have a sense that the lever's there. They don't realize that they themselves, through their courtship of Iran, through these other steps that we've mentioned, they've severed the link between the lever and the Saudis. And they went there and they pulled it, and they were surprised that it didn't work. I can't understand that. I can't understand that trip otherwise, because President Biden went there. It was costly for him somewhat politically with the progressives, because he had promised to make Mohammed bin Salman a pariah, and then he had to go and meet with him personally. And so that was a concession, but then he got nothing in return for it. And so what's your understanding? I know that again, you're not here to explain the Americans to the Americans, but help us understand. How do you think that that trip came about? What were the Americans thinking? Why are they getting it so wrong?
So I don't think the Americans got nothing from that trip, right? Saudi Arabia, part of its power is its ability to convene. larger groups, and they did convene the Gulf Cooperation Council.
For Xi Jinping in December.
And they did that for President Trump as well. I mean, that's one of the unique selling points that only Saudi Arabia has in the region. They do have that type of political influence, and it's no secret the Chinese are eyeing that sort of power in order to benefit themselves. But I think President Biden's speech was an excellent speech when he was there. I mean, the idea was that there was a sort of pivot away from the region, but the region is still important. We have to respect sovereignty, and we have to respect borders, and we have to bring in stability. It was everything that those leaders in the room listening to him wanted to hear. In practice, this is a longer discussion. The region is just going through a very difficult time. Israel is going through a very difficult time. Syria is in flux. There have been protests in Iran, and Iran didn't at that point in time de-escalate or decrease its provocations across the region. So I think absent a more clear and tangible strategy, right? And I'm not talking about large principles, but a very clear strategy, then the region is in for tough times. Again, when I speak to people in the region, and it's not just in Saudi Arabia, the whole idea is, the U.S. has to decide what it wants. That's less important than it wanting things that we want. We need to understand where this is going.
What I thought you were going to say was that President Biden went and gave a very good speech, and it was all the words that everyone wanted to hear, but that it wasn't backed up by policy. Is that your view, or am I putting words in your mouth?
I mean, there's a lot more that can be done, that's for sure, right? And that clarity on a specific level as to what exactly is the U.S. strategy, what is the ideal-looking Middle East, and where do U.S. partners fall in that equation, right? How can they be useful, right? What you had in the past is that you had this U.S. post-Soviet, post-Pax Americana security order in the Middle East, and you had these pillars to this security order. Israel was one, the Saudis were another one, and Ankara was the third one. And they don't have to like each other, the pillars, right? But they all understood what their role was within this American order, right? And now there's confusion as to whether America wants to maintain this order.
Right.
And that's the issue. That's the problem here. And,
well, now that you've raised raised again the Israelis and the Turks, we do see, however you want to define it, we don't need to quibble over the words, but the United States is pulling back from the Middle East. It's not engaging like it used to. And that's leading to a kind of reshuffling of the cards. Partly it means bigger role for China. We see that the Saudis and the Iranians are even reevaluating their relations. But also you have reevaluation of relations with Israel and a lot of its Arab neighbors and Ankara. What's the view from Riyadh? How is Riyadh thinking in particular about the Israelis and the Turks?
Well, I mean, there was a recent deposit in the central bank in Turkey of $5 billion. Relations are better than they've been for many years, much better right now with Ankara. In Israel, everyone heard what the Crown Prince said. We don't look at Israel as an enemy, but as a potential ally, a potential partner. But, peace with Israel and normalization with Israel is still hinging on a meaningful process for the Palestinians and recognition of Palestinian statehood. So all of these things, I think, are going in the right direction. And it goes towards the earlier point that we were discussing, that all of these allies are realizing that it might be too dangerous for the region to be left to its own devices, absent, thoughtful and meaningful dialogue among America's partners in the region. Right?
Can we imagine? You know the question I'm going to ask you. Can we imagine security cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Turkey?
I think that already exists.
Can we imagine deepening security cooperation between Saudi Arabia?
I think that's something that can be imagined.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you have any reason? Do you have reason to believe there's thinking along those lines or discussions, or is this just within the realm of the imaginable?
It's not something that I heard or something that I'm aware is happening, but there definitely is security cooperation with Turkey. You know, this idea of you know, we're already seeing Turkey and Israel step up their security cooperation and start to look at the region in very similar ways. I would imagine that it wouldn't be unlikely to see more of that.
It would not be unlikely to see more of that. Is that what you said?
Yes.
How many negatives can you get there? You mentioned you know, what the allies are having trouble understanding. What's the American vision of the region? What do the Americans want from the various partners? And the Americans themselves are confused about that. One of the
maybe the entire region is just confused, but it certainly seems that nobody understands what America's priorities.
No, you're not going to get any argument from me about that. One of the best articles that you've written, by the way, I want to commend all of your articles to the viewers, which you can find on Hudson's website. But among those, one of the best, I thought, one of the most interesting was an article you wrote about a year ago about the young population in the Middle East and two visions of the future of the region and of the future for those young people that is being sorted out right now. The vision in Riyadh and the vision in Tehran. And just, I wonder if you could just walk us through the argument a little bit, because I think it's something that should be on the minds of decision makers in Washington, but isn't.
Thank you. No, yeah, I was on the train heading to Boston, and I was just trying to put in one or two sentences what the difference is between the Iranian regime and the Saudis. And what I came up with is that in Iran, you have a reactionary, anti-imperialistic, anti-Western Islamist regime that views young people as a threat and tries to use that backwards reactionary Islamism to crush the aspirations of these threatening young people. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, you have a government that is drawing on the energy and the capabilities of its large youth bulge, its young population, in order to crush that backwards reactionary anti-Western Islamism. So you have two very opposite approaches, right? In Saudi Arabia, you have a government that is sending students to study abroad by the hundreds of thousands. I was a beneficiary of that program. All of my siblings were beneficiaries of that program, and most of my cousins were beneficiaries of that program. So it's very clear how there is a fundamental difference in the way that they're dealing with young people. And it's not just Iran, right? There are other governments in the region that view young people as a threat. Again, you know, while in Germany or elsewhere in Europe, you have birth rates languishing below replacement levels. And in Japan, it's extremely pronounced. What you have in the global south in general, but especially in the Middle East, this booming young people population, right? So the future of the world is going to be decided by these people that are under 30 years of age. And there are two different models in the region on how to deal with them. There's no one perfect in the region, but there are two starkly different models on how to deal with young people. One in Saudi Arabia and one in Iran and elsewhere, Lebanon, Iraq, you name it.
Wherever Iran is dominant.
Wherever Iran is dominant. So, I mean, the West essentially has to choose, right? Whichever model prevails is going to set the entire world up over the past, over the future 20, 30, 40 years. It's going to decide the future. And it's the same elsewhere, right? In Southeast Asia, you have large young populations in Africa. So I think more thought has to be put into how are we going to deal with young people and which model of dealing with young people are we going to support. In Saudi Arabia, what we're seeing today is that, you know, if you're a young Saudi woman, your life is totally different. It's like living in a different country.
Right.
In Iran, 16-year-old girls are being shot in the head for not wearing hijab in the street. I mean, it's
Poisoned in their schools.
yeah.
Do you think it's fair to say that the Biden administration has chosen in favor of the Iranian model? By its, can we infer that on the basis of its policy choices?
So now I'm going to turn the table and recommend that everybody reads your article, the realignment. And in that article, that's what Mike Turan is arguing. But
If we just go back and forth like this and recommend each other's articles, it'll be exciting for me and you, but it'll be boring for everybody else.
I think it might already be, but no, I think, look, I think there's a very dangerous assumption that unfortunately I suspect is...
but you're right, it was a great article. No, go ahead, sorry.
That unfortunately constitutes the basis of a lot of thinking in Washington, whether it's in this administration or elsewhere within policy circles. And it's that people in the region are fundamentally anti-American, right? And they're anti-imperialist. And this big bad US empire should stop meddling in the region because they don't like us, and we should just leave them alone not to like us. And that's a mistaken assessment of youth opinions as we see them today, right? So if that's your assumption, then accepting the Iranian model or letting the Iranian model win in the region, I still wouldn't agree that this is a good policy, but I would understand the logic behind arguing that. But the problem is the young Iranian people are avoiding stepping on the American flag. It's not 1995 anymore. In 1995, you had a bunch of young people that wanted to burn American flags and would use anti-American slogans. Those people don't exist anymore. Young people today, the vast majority of the Middle East are under 30 years of age, and the issues that they have are issues with these reactionary, backwards Islamist leaders that offer nothing and promise nothing but misery. Right? These people are plugged into online, they watch movies, they watch Netflix. They're just not fundamentally anti-American people. They're not.
I think
that's what I think people have to realize here in Washington before they start making policies. They are supporting something that is unsustainable. The way that young people are being dealt with in Iran on every level, economic, social, is just not a sustainable model. Something's got to give someday. I don't know when that day is, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. But I think people in the Gulf realize that. In Saudi, they realize it. In the UAE, they realize it. And they're ahead of the curve.
The thing is, the two things are striking to me. Because I got involved in the policy debates about the Middle East after 9/11. And at that time, right after 9/11, there was an enormous amount of discussion about the youth bulge in the Middle East and how all of these young people were being indoctrinated into extremist ideology. It was hostile to the West. And if you told a decision maker in Washington that the Saudi government was going to carry out a list of reforms along the lines of which Mohammed bin Salman has carried out, particularly with respect to young people. If you had told them back in 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, they'd say, that is fantastic. They couldn't even possibly imagine it. But they would say, that is what we want. That's the thing that we most want from Saudi Arabia, to carry out reforms like this. Saudi Arabia has done it. The chance that it can be repealed, I think you'll know much better than I, is very small because of the fact that this is such a large percentage of the population, because it is so popular by all accounts. These are enormously popular reforms, and people sense when they go an excitement about where the country is going. It's a large country. It's going to become bigger. It has an enormous impact on the whole region. It has this convening power, as you described. And then we have this other country, Iran, which represents all of the worst that the Middle East can possibly come up with, and not just from a Shiite point of view. It's also supporting all of the worst actors in the Sunni world as well, including Al Qaeda, including ISIS to a certain extent, including Hamas, and so on and so forth. And the idea that the United States would, I'm editorializing now, but the idea that the United States would look at that picture and say, we're going to denigrate our ally that's carried out these reforms, and we're going to reward the Iranians with all of this sanctions relief, is unfathomable to me. Actually, it's not unfathomable because I've been witnessing it, but it's remarkable. Anyway, that's not a question. That's just a reaction. And I would, for that reason, I would commend your article, which doesn't put it in such stark terms as I did, but it lays out the case. And we should be thinking about these choices of course, they're about security questions, and of course, they're about competition between states. But there's also a larger orientation of an entire region that's at stake, and we're making the wrong choices. It seems to me. Anyway, if you have a reaction to that, you can go ahead and react, and then we'll open it up here to questions.
No, I'll just reiterate. I mean, I think to a large degree, the problem here is one of assumptions. There is an assumption that people are fundamentally anti-American, that they are, that young people are similar to what they were in the 90s, that the rhetoric that they hear from these backwards reactionary Islamists is resonating with them. It's just not, right? And once
I think it's resonating with the Westerners. I mean, with progressives, the Nasserist, Islamist rhetoric. It resonates with the European left and with the progressives in the United States.
Yeah.
Again, I'm putting words in your mouth, but that's.
No, I mean, if you talk to a lot of university professors on the left, what they will describe to you is a Middle East that doesn't exist. I don't know where they got these ideas from, but if they go and visit Saudi Arabia, if they visit Iran, I mean, if you look at videos of young people in universities in Iran, the regime would print these large U.S. flags on the ground so that they can step on the U.S. flag. And there's plenty of photos of students just going around refusing to do that. You know, I remember in the 90s opening the television channel, the TV, and seeing American flags being burned. I don't remember the last time I opened the TV and saw any American flag being burned by young people in the region. I don't remember. People just don't do that anymore. I see photos of these Islamists being burned in Iraq and Babel among young Arab Shias. I see plenty of that, right? So I think that's the cue people in the United States would be very wise to notice, right? That's the truth of the region.
It's actually a remarkable fact that in Iran we have 2 or 3 generations of young people have been raised to hate the United States, to hate the West, and it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. I mean, it's backfired. They have total control over the education system and over the media, and they have the coercive power of the state, and yet people are still looking to the West and they want a connection with it. It's remarkable, actually. But if only we had people in the White House who wanted to capitalize on that, then we'd be in a better situation. Okay, so we have a little time for a couple of questions here. If anyone in the, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Adnan Hassan. I'm an investor who's been in the business for about 30 years. I serve on the board of directors of the World Bank and I know the kingdom quite well. How should we read the fact that the signing that happened between the kingdom and the Iranians was by the national security advisors and not the ministers of foreign affairs? How should we read that? And the second one is that on China, not specifically with the kingdom or the region, but globally, their demographics are a very worrisome element to themselves. We talk about the youth bulge as being an asset. In the case of China, their population is aging the way Japan's did. And you know what happened in Japan. Those of you who've been around for a while may remember that in the late 80s, Japan was the one that was the big threat, that it was going to take over everything and they were going to buy up everything. And if you remember, those of you who've been around, that on Capitol Hill, they parked a Toyota and a bunch of congressmen came out with sledgehammers and actually beat the crap out of that Toyota as a symbol of the fact that, we got to take on Japan because this is too much. We're being exploited and abused by Japan. And then, of course, all that happened in Japan. They basically just imploded, both financially and because of the demographic realities. I'm not underestimating the issues about the Thucydides trap between a rising China and a U.S. presence and how that should be navigated. But what's your view on the fact that the demographic realities of China are a negative for them, and how is that going to take some of the air out of their potential ambitions? So, and the National Security Advisor choice as opposed to foreign affairs, how should we read it?
Yeah.
And the Chinese threat, how, not to underestimate it, but how does it play itself out?
Right. So on your first question, I mean, one can assume because it's a national security deal, it was negotiated by the national security advisors. There was a phone call yesterday between the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia and the foreign minister of Iran, and there are visits planned between the foreign ministers. That's my read onto that one. And the second part is, it's a very good and very difficult question. You know, I don't think I'm alone in being late to the game to understand China or struggling to understand China, right? I am familiar that there is, they have these demographic problems in the country, and I don't know, frankly, how they plan to deal with them. What I do know, though, is that if you compare China today to 5 years ago, what they are offering and what they are capable of doing, the difference is night and day. And then your last question was, yeah, perfect.
I just would, I might add that clearly China has a lot of challenges, the demographic challenge. It also has a lot of economic problems right now and so on. I just want to add an editorial comment that it's very dangerous, I think, for Americans to assume that other people's difficulties and mistakes will save us from our own bad thinking. So that China is pursuing the largest military buildup in history and pursuing it successfully. Maybe we'll get lucky, and all of the worst thinking about what might happen to us as China gets more powerful will go the way of all that thinking about Japan in the 1980s. But just because we got it wrong in the past doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be wrong in the future. I'd rather be safe than sorry. That's my editorial comment, sir.
Josh Carton. I'm affiliated with the Scowcroft Center's Indo-Pacific Security Initiative. I also have a China-related question. You've critiqued what you've called a lack of U.S. strategic clarity or a lack of clarity about the U.S. vision for engagement in the Middle East. So as Saudi and other Middle Eastern parties welcome more Chinese engagement, what is your understanding of what China's vision for the Middle East is? What does China want to see in the medium term in the region? Over.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. Again, right, there's a reason that there isn't a large body of literature on China's strategic priorities among all the think tanks that we look at today or in universities, because it's still a black box. People still are wondering what the Chinese priorities are. But what I can say is that we're increasingly noticing the Chinese going off of the US playbook. Wherever they see there is US influence, they would like to replace the United States in having that influence. Now, if you were to ask me about Saudi Arabia or the region, being able to influence exercise a degree of control over key waterways like Bab el-Mandeb and Hormuz is something extremely important, right? Almost everything that passes through Suez also passes through Bab el-Mandeb. And I forgot the exact percentage of the world's energy supply that passes through these choke points. So that's how one must understand the Chinese building a base in Djibouti. The Chinese, I think, have identical interest to the United States in making sure that the global energy supply remains stable. Now, what you'd get, I was having a conversation with one former policymaker here in the United States a few days ago, and he said, well, this is great for America. If they want to stabilize energy, why don't we just let them and we'll be free riders, because they were free riders before. Again, I don't think it's that simple. If you do reach a situation where there is conflict, or where things escalate, as we mentioned. Who has the leverage and the influence over these strategic waterways and the stability of oil will make all of the difference. So I think the Chinese government now is definitely looking to supplant the United States in one way, shape, or form. And I think they would jump at the opportunity to build bases in some of the smaller Gulf states that are in the region. And they've been waiting diligently to be involved in something as strategic as the Beijing Agreement for years. And the reason that many of America's partners in the region have declined to go that route is because they were still anticipating some breakthrough in terms of finding a strategy with the United States. And again, it's unwise, I think, to overblow the Beijing Agreement. It's a very specific agreement that the Chinese have looked at, and it's a narrow agreement in scope. There's been a lot of alarmism. The Chinese have taken over the Middle East because the United States is sleeping. It's not quite what happened, at least it's certainly not what happened yet. But also, China is Saudi Arabia's largest trade partner. And the Saudis have just bought 10% of one of China's main refineries. And that comes with a commitment that the Chinese would buy a certain amount of Saudi oil. So China does have a vested interest in the region on a commercial, economic level. And it's realizing increasingly that it has that interest on a deeply strategic level.
Can you unpack a little bit the statement you just made at the beginning of your remarks, that China is following the American playbook?
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is interested in bringing stability to the region because instability can destabilize global energy markets and the global economy, the harms of having instability and war in the region are that's a long list. I think the Chinese have those same anxieties that the Americans have, right? There's a huge overlap. Now, they perhaps view America's ability to influence these things with envy and want to be able to do the same thing. That certainly seems like what their goals are when I speak to Chinese diplomats or analysts. Yeah, that answers it.
Sir.
Thank you very much. Hashim Malavi from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Mohammed, I'd love to get your thoughts on the view from Riyadh of the other Asian power, India, and a place where the demographics are not declining and energy consumption is rising and the economy is growing, and India's been pretty deft in maneuvering the geopolitics of the Russia-Ukraine war. And so I'd love to get your thoughts on the view from Riyadh towards India.
Yeah, I visited New Delhi for the first time in 2014, and they had this a conference on the Arab Spring, and I was asked along with one other person to try to explain why the Arab Spring spread through Arab republics but didn't affect Arab monarchies. That's a separate discussion. But what I was shocked by is speaking with very high-level Indian officials, both military officials and foreign service officials, is that they were under the impression that Saudi Arabia is squarely pro-Pakistani, and that necessarily means that they are anti-Indian. And how can they fix that problem? So I was a bit shocked. I said that there is no problem to fix. If that's what you think, that's not the issue. What we've seen recently is a flurry of diplomatic activity between the entire Gulf, not just Saudi Arabia and India. And trade between those two countries has been growing very rapidly. And if the Chinese, Indian, and even Saudi economy, the Saudi economy right now is the 15th largest economy in the world, and by 2030 they want it to be the 10th largest economy in the world. Then these things can only grow. I mean, yeah.
I was just in India when the news broke of the China brokered deal with Iran and Saudi Arabia. And the reaction there was fascinating because I was meeting with top officials, and they were having a debate among themselves. So they were quite open about about whether India had missed an opportunity, because since India has historically good relations with both Iran and the Gulf states, should it have been the one to play the role that China was playing? And just listening to the debate made it clear to me that they have aspirations to play such a role. So it's going to be interesting to see in the future. Time for one more, I think. Yes, sir. Here.
Hussein Abu Bakr from Endowment for Middle East Truth. Mohammed, I want to ask actually about Syria. First of all, you said, the White House told the Saudis you're not allowed to meet the Russians, but the Saudis did meet the Russians, and the Saudi foreign minister was in actually Moscow at the same time that the deal with Beijing was announced. And then we saw, of course, a resumption of the consular services, the Saudi consular services in Damascus, and recently we heard that President Bashar al-Assad has been basically he's going to join the Arab League summit in Riyadh. Given the complexities in Syria, I mean, you're talking about a theater in which the Iranians just attacked the Americans responded back, and the Israelis. What realistic strategic objectives could the Saudis have in Syria in trying to bringing back Bashar al-Assad like this?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if he will be brought back or if he won't be brought back. But the idea, I think, here is if you were to speak to officials in the Gulf in general, not just Saudi Arabia, that keeping the doors for dialogue open is the wise way to look at it. And you're correct to mention that it is just consular services so far, and it will not be embassies as of yet. But the answer you might get in Riyadh is if you're opening your embassy in Iran, what would the rationale be of not opening the embassy in Damascus, right? If Iran was complicit, much more so than any other actor in the Syrian crisis. If you're seeking to find ways to destabilize with Iran, then what's the use of continuing this excommunication of Assad?
Okay, on that depressing note, let me just add that actually, so that it doesn't look like I was criticizing Saudi Arabia, I'm sure with no doubt whatsoever that the Saudis have been urged by the Biden administration to do this.
I was hoping you'd say that and that I'd stay quiet.
Okay, on that note, we'll call an end to this session. And please join me in thanking Mohammed for an extremely interesting and insightful conversation.